So this is interesting because we got the sales numbers overall for Final Fantasy XVI, and Square Enix announced that shipments and digital sales have surpassed 3 million units in about 6 days on the market. That's something that I covered on the channel here, and for the most part, people seem to be a little bit mixed on that, or more positive when it comes to the PS5 in general and an exclusive selling 3 million in 6 days. Heck, that's still good and a lot of revenue coming in, so you can't really hate on that. And I'm really enjoying Final Fantasy XVI. I enjoy the gameplay. I think that it's a lot of fun. I think that the combat is there. The story and cinematics are really crazy. There's a few things that I don't like here and there with the structure of the game, but the story and the combat shines through, so I can forgive some of those things. And I'm just enjoying my playthrough of the game. But the interesting thing about it is that there's been a lot of talk about the most recent information to come out from the Famitsu sales, because while we got an overall look at the global situation, there is a whole separate type of conversation when it comes to Final Fantasy in Japan and what the franchise used to be for console sales and also the sale of the game compared to what it is now at this point, because we have some breakdowns here, and I think that it shows that Square Enix has made a few mistakes and needs to righten things up, and I know exactly what they need to do. But before we get into that, what's good everyone, OJ here. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, and click that notification bell to get our videos first. And check out our daily live streams, PE Live at 7 p.m. Eastern time right here on the channel. Now let's go on and jump right back into this, because once again, the Famitsu sales are out there in the wild, not at this point for this past week. This is June 19th, 2023 to June 25th, 2023. We have physical sales. Now, this does not include digital ratios here, just physical sales, so we will be talking about that here. Final Fantasy XVI opens up at 336,027 units. Now, when it comes to Japanese PS5 titles, that instantly becomes the #1 best-selling debut, the #1 title over there in Japan, Final Fantasy XVI. So definitely not bad at all. However, if you start comparing it to previous Final Fantasy, so if you kind of go a little bit more into the scores and a little bit more into the sales numbers, you kind of see that there is a stark drop in the popularity of Final Fantasy, and it's not doing what it once used to do. So the PS5 hardware sales, which many people told me, wait till Final Fantasy comes out, wait till Final Fantasy comes out, it's going to be selling hundreds of thousands of units with Final Fantasy. Well, that didn't necessarily happen at all, because the PS5 hardware debut sales in Japan with Final Fantasy XVI was at 85,385 units. Now, once again, not a bad overall total, but for a massive supposed system seller coming out, to not get over 100,000 units is, I think, a little bit surprising to many people there. Once again, not the end of the world, and definitely a bump up by around, I think, 30,000 units from the previous week. So there definitely was more people who went out there and bought that Final Fantasy XVI bundle and bought the PS5 just so they can play Final Fantasy XVI, but it wasn't as big of a bump as maybe some would have thought. Now, also to kind of compound this, the Nintendo Switch, which didn't get any big new releases for the week outside of Sonic Origins Plus, which was the 22nd best-selling title out of the week, but there was no big new games in the top 10. It's just on the strength of all the evergreen games like Zelda and all that. That actually sold 105,990 units. So Switch somehow did even better in the launch week for one of the biggest franchises in Japan with Final Fantasy. So there is absolutely something when it comes to what's going on in Japan, and there just being not as big of an interest in the PlayStation 5. And if you look at the PS5 sales, and if you look at the debut just in Japan, when it comes to it, it seems like, yeah, it seems like people are just saying, okay, it's nice, but we're buying other things. Now, if you compare it to previous Final Fantasy games, especially with Final Fantasy 15, you start seeing a little bit more interesting things here as an analysis. Final Fantasy 15 sold nearly 700,000 units. Actually, some numbers, Famitsu adjusted it to over 700,000 units on the PS4 alone in Japan, debut week, 700,000 units plus. And that was back in 2016 with a slightly lower install base than the PS5 has aligned right now with Final Fantasy XVI. So if you compare them, it's not like the PlayStation 4 had a huge install base lead in Japan when Final Fantasy 15 came out. The PS5 actually has a little bit more of an install base, yet Final Fantasy 15 sold considerably better at launch. Now, even if you factor in digital sales, which weren't factored in for the Famitsu sales back then, and also not at this point, it's not going to cover that hundreds of thousands of units, plus the 50% plus drop that we're seeing here from Final Fantasy 15 to Final Fantasy 16 in Japan. And on top of that, if you look at the hardware sales, back when Final Fantasy 15 came out, it was actually a pretty big system seller because it boosted the sales from 42,000 units the week prior to over 118,000 units the week that Final Fantasy came out. And with ample stock at this point with the PS5 in Japan, the fact that the sales weren't boosted at least to 100,000 units or so is definitely showing that there is a decline in interest, because it's one thing to say, okay, we don't have digital sales or we have to wait and see for more of it, but it's another thing to look at the raw hardware sales numbers without any shortages or any issues and a really nice Final Fantasy bundle, and the sales weren't even above 100,000 units for that week, which every single time, if you look at the history of Final Fantasy, anytime a big Final Fantasy game launches, they're going to be boosted way up compared to the previous week. So I'm definitely thinking that Square Enix is looking at that and saying, okay, at least we thought maybe the PS5 sales would be a bit higher. And I think the reality of the situation is, no matter what type of install base or whatever you want to put to it, but I think that the brutal honest reality of it here is, guys, after I've done my full analysis with everything, is that this is one of the worst debuts for Final Fantasy in Japan, period. Like, if you just look at it, and I know there's been different install bases and all that, but overall it's just one of the worst debuts. So definitely Final Fantasy, when it comes to what they're doing or what they're going to do in the future, I think that they don't necessarily have to completely change course or anything like that. They can still make this action Final Fantasy game that they want to make if they want to go forward with it. They can still make Final Fantasy VII Remake. I think that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, that's going to be a great game that's going to sell really well. I think it's going to sell better than Final Fantasy XVI because you have Cloud and Tifa and Barret and the gang's all back together, and the story and the characters, and you have an open-ended world there, and you have all sorts of cool stuff with that combat system, dual text that they're doing, and you can change characters. I think it fits more of the sensibilities of what Japanese gamers want and what Japanese gamers will buy over Final Fantasy XVI. But I do feel that Square Enix has made a grave mistake here with Final Fantasy. If you're looking at the landscape of Japanese major titles, we've seen unprecedented levels of explosion and growth between games like Monster Hunter, between games like Zelda, for example, Persona. A lot of these games have been expanding and beating out the previous entries. So every entry that comes out, you have explosions of sales. So you have way bigger sales numbers than previously done before. But Final Fantasy seems to not be in that boat. And yes, you're comparing multi-platform to non-multi-platform, or in some cases, obviously, Zelda exploded with Breath of the Wild. But at the same time, like, Final Fantasy has the capacity to also do that. But the problem is that right now, the Nintendo Switch is the dominant platform when it comes to Japan, and one of the most dominant platforms in the world, and people still want to play that old school style of Final Fantasy games. So that old school Final Fantasy turn-based type of game. And I'm not saying that they have to remove FF7 Rebirth or remove Final Fantasy 16. They just need to add a modern sensibility take on the old school Final Fantasy formula that was so successful for them in the past, with some of the best selling games in the franchise being from the PS1 era and being from the PS2 era, where that style of gameplay was so prevalent. And I think that that style of gameplay can still be made today on the Nintendo Switch going forward, and then you can have that ported over to other systems. Games like Dragon Quest have massive launches in Japan, Persona, massive launches, Pokemon, massive launches in Japan and also worldwide with huge sales numbers. There's no reason why Square Enix can't make a high-end AAA ATB turn-based Final Fantasy game on the Nintendo Switch, or at least more like they should have at this point, and sell 10 million copies and have that ported over to other systems. look, we saw this with Monster Hunter Rise. I mean, people were a little bit skeptical on how well it would do, considering it was only on that platform at first, but it ended up selling over 10 million units and being one of the best-selling third-party games on the Nintendo Switch. Capcom raked in hundreds of millions of dollars on this Switch alone with Monster Hunter Rise. If Square Enix was to have a high-end Final Fantasy game that was the old school style base, that style that people are looking for to complement Final Fantasy XVI and to complement Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Rebirth, and all of that, that would create a huge sales boom for the Final Fantasy franchise, just like Final Fantasy XIV was a huge boom for the Final Fantasy franchise when they built the type of game that PC MMO players want to play. There's still an untapped potential. There's still an untapped market when it comes to Final Fantasy and the old school style of play that isn't Octopath Traveler. Obviously, that doesn't have the money that you would put into a AAA Final Fantasy game with the themes and the music and what people are looking for. That's just more popular. Or even if it's a different game like Live Alive, some of their remakes, or a different game like Bravely Default, those just aren't going to have the prestige and the money put into it to do the type of numbers that could be done if there is a high-end Final Fantasy game. And heck, even if you look at it with Capcom, Monster Hunter, they have Monster Hunter World, they have Monster Hunter Rise, they have Monster Hunter Stories. I mean, they have split the franchise kind of into different spheres here at this point, and I think that Square Enix could do the same thing to great success going forward. But maybe that's a little bit too late now at this point with the Nintendo Switch all the way going in its 7th year. Maybe that's something they should have figured out like back in 2018, 2019 and started planning for that, or maybe a bit later so that you can have a game that comes out. Or maybe they were just laser focused when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and all of what they're doing there. But I will say this, I think that going forward, Square Enix absolutely needs to look into what I'm talking about here, because you can have a much bigger launch and expand Final Fantasy sales even bigger if they did this. Look at the growth of Persona. Look at the growth of some of these other turn-based franchises. Look at how Pokemon is still exploding. Look at how there's still quite a number of people that want to play these type of games with the Final Fantasy style of characters and branding and everything. So I think that Square Enix should absolutely do that. I'm analyzing these sales numbers and I'm looking through and I'm seeing that, yeah, like, well, Final Fantasy XVI, it did fantastic overall, and I think that the Western audience is taking a liking to it. You can have that, and you can also have a turn-based ATB Final Fantasy that does incredible numbers in Japan and worldwide, and you can suit different audiences. You can build up a whole new business model based off of different styles of Final Fantasy, like they've kind of already done with Final Fantasy XIV, with Final Fantasy XVI, with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. You can add one more in there. Final Fantasy does have the capacity and it's big enough for that, but we're gonna have to wait and see overall what Square Enix wants to do. And I just think that there's an opportunity here, especially going forward into the next generation with the Nintendo Switch, what they do there. Heck, you can start building it now. You can still have Switch games in a couple years or 3 years and have a cross-gen type of title and port it over to other platforms as well. I think that would work too. But what do you guys think about this when it comes to my long-winded explanation with what's going on with the Final Fantasy XVI sales in Japan, and also my proposal in terms of what Final Fantasy can do in the future? Let me know about that. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, click that notification bell, and check out some of our other videos right here on screen. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you for the next one. Peace.